All right, welcome back to AP Human Geography. Here is your second key issue of Chapter 1. Key issue is why is every place unique? So we're going to talk about site, situation, place name, and all sorts of good stuff today. So let's go. So first of all, the sense of place, right? The idea of uh, place is pretty personal. People have ideas and feelings about what makes each spot unique. Think about the place that your go-to, your favorite place in the world, right? There's senses of smell that go with it that you associate with. There's feelings of safety, perhaps, or family, something along those lines. We identify location four ways: through place name, through site, which is its unique physical characteristics, sometimes cultural characteristics too, and situation, which is what its relative location, what is it near. Also, that we talked about absolute location in 1.1 as well. So if you don't remember, this is your gentle reminder that when you see a green slide, this is not from the book. Our book is relatively new. It does cover a lot of things, but it does not cover everything. So you're going to see some of these things other places, right? You might want a screenshot. Might be a good thing for you to do. Screenshot or take a picture with your camera if this is live. All right, so our first green slide of the day is something called sequential occupancies or sequent occupants. Right? And that basically means that each society, there's layers of a society in a place, right? Previous societies leave their imprint on the current society occupying an area and may even contribute to it. All right, so we look at the geography. This is where history and geography kind of come together, right? So places like Chicago, that used to have a huge indigenous population in urban area there. Colonial periods will leave an imprint on the landscape long after the places become independent. You'll see this in Mexico City with the Aztec capital of Teotihuacan being there before, and occasionally that even pops up when there's seismic activity. All right, place name is one way that we describe place. What do we call a place, right? The geo-nerd way to describe that, the technical term is toponym. So we talk about how a place gets named. Do you ever wonder that? Sometimes it's named after people, like Lincoln, Nebraska, or Washington County, Washington, D.C., Washington State, all sorts of different places, right? It could reflect the religious nature. Anytime you hear a saint or a sal or a san, S-A-N, think Catholicism, right? So St. Paul, for example, heavily dominated by the Catholic population of Minnesota. San Francisco, right, is St. Francis or St. Francisco. Sao Paulo is St. Paul, just down yonder in Brazil. All right, we can look at settlers. If you will hear New England, right? Well, the English populated that area. El Paso, you can hear the Spanish there. Baton Rouge is definitely French sounding because because Louisiana was a French colony. We could talk about physical features like Apple Valley, right? Maybe there were some apple trees in a valley there. We can talk about resources like Silver Creek, right? Implying that there's something that would be to be gained from there. All right. Remember, names can be changed, right? Names can be changed. So think about like Embarrass, Minnesota was changed. Truth and Consequences, New Mexico was changed because of won a contest, or there was a contest and named after the quiz show. We have good examples, right? So again, we look at how our language is connected. We think about toponyms, right? Would you rather live in Mount Prospect or on Mount Misery, right? We can think about migration flows as well. All right, we can talk about other descriptives. We look at 10 things there. Places like commendatory ideas, right? Like Paradise Valley. Who wouldn't want to live in paradise, right? Um, Battle Creek, Michigan was named after, there was a battle near a creek at some point. Johnson City, named, Johnson was the founder of that city. We have folk culture like Plains, Georgia. Truth or Consequences was voted, right? There's even mistakes, right? Like Alaska, North Carolina was named after Alaska, but it was mispronounced or misspelled somehow, right? And then Lancaster, right? Like Lancaster, Pennsylvania, relocated, from Lancaster, England. All right, so we have place name or toponym. Our second way of describing is through site, and this is the physical aspects of a place and why you would name it, why a place is unique. Okay, also explains why you might settle there too. Okay, so what does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? Think about topography and elevation in there as well. That you might want to put your city, if you're going to build a city, on higher ground, right? To avoid water, right? But also to avoid as a defensive mechanism, right? So again, we look at the location of places, economics. You want to be on rich land or something along those lines, defensive purposes in terms of topography, things like that. Now, keep in mind, we can alter these things. The book uses Manhattan as a good example of that. Manhattan used to look like this in 1650. It looks like this in the 1990s. This is extremely difficult to do, but it can be done, right? You can alter, you can bulldoze mountains or blow them up. You can add to places where the real estate is very expensive, right? So we look at Boston, right? Right in here, this Back Bay right in here. Number 7, Back Bay, used to be literally the Back Bay, right? But it has been filled in, right? You see this in Tokyo, right? All of these areas, land filled, right? In here, all that, adding to that place. Again, not something you do in Cottage Grove, but might be something you do in a place like Tokyo with massive real estate prices and a massive population. Shanghai, you see that as well. Right, that all of this has been added as well. All right, time to talk about activity spaces, right? These are spaces where we routinely travel in our daily activities, right? And this is where we can start talking about mental mapping as well. Mental mapping is your idea, your paradigm of a place, right? Not only just how you get there, but what it looks like and what it's like, all right? So, your activity space, you're pretty, your activity space are well defined, they're automatic, right? So if I told you to describe to me how do you get from your house to school, it might be difficult because you do it every day and you don't think about what street you're driving down, you just do it, right? When we think about this in terms of gender, we can start talking about this in gender, that men tend to use paths, whereas women tend to use landmarks to describe things. All right, our third and final way of describing place is through situation, right? Which is also known as relative location. So where is it relative to others? This is good for two things. One is describing how to get to a place. So if you're trying to get to the Tate Lab of Physics and you don't know where it is, but you talk to somebody and they say, oh, it's right in the mall area, and you know where the mall is, you're golden, right? Or you know it's near Smith Hall, if somebody tells you that. Then you can get there, right? That's only good if you know what's going on in this area. So that's one way to describe it, and many of you would use situation to describe how to get to your house from school. You'd say, oh, it's by Menards, or oh, it's near a church, oh, it's right by this elementary school, right? The second useful thing for situation is it can tell you why you would put a city where you put a city, right? Ports, for example, right? You would put things near an ocean because an ocean provides not only transportation but a source of food in fishing, right? Louisiana would be a good example. New Orleans, right? Right at the mouth of the Mississippi River where it meets the Gulf of Mexico, Shanghai, another good example, right? At the mouth of the Yangtze River and the East China Sea, right where they meet. So it's situated in a pretty sweet spot. Minneapolis, St. Paul, situated where two rivers, the Minnesota um, and the Mississippi, where they intersect, right? So this has a strategic location, right? It's situated in a good spot for transportation routes. Right, so back to mental maps, right? These are images or pictures of a way a space is organized as determined by an individual's perception, impression, and knowledge of that space, right? So this is your paradigm. This is what a place is like, right? You have ideas of what a place is like. You have an idea of what New York City is like. You have an idea of what Chicago is like, right? And if you've been to those places, you're going to have greater sense of place, right? I have never been to Los Angeles, but I've read so many novels and I've seen so many movies. And I watch Bosch, which is an ode to LA, even though it's a detective story, right? And I feel like I have an idea of LA, but I've never actually been there. So is my mental map actually that good? Probably not. Right? Our fourth one, again, we look at absolute location. What are its coordinates? We talked a little bit about this. We can describe it in terms of street address. We talked about this in 1.1. So we're not going to go over latitude and longitude quite again, right? Absolute location, street addresses are absolute as well because they don't necessarily change. It would take a lot to change that. All right. Regions are another important concept, right? The idea of regions. We talk in regions all the time. We don't always know it, but we do that, right? A region is an area is defined by one or more distinctive traits, right? And this can be difficult to define. We're going to talk about three different types of regions: formal, functional, and vernacular or perceptual regions. And again, think about a place belonging to many regions. So think about your house, right? It belongs in a neighborhood, right? Where that neighborhood starts and where it ends can maybe be defined on a map. Maybe it can't. It's in Cottage Grove or St. Paul Park. Maybe it's somewhere else, but I'm going to assume it's in one of those two cities. Those are easily defined. There are boundaries there. So that would be more of a formal region, right? But the Midwest, right? It's going to be a little less, it's going to be a little bit more gray. So we'll get into this, right? Let's talk about the three types of regions. They're pretty important for AP, so you should know these, right? There's a formal region. It can be defined on a map, right? And you see uniformity throughout, right? Meaning that if you are over here, right, the people over here speak the same amount of Russian way up here as they do right in the middle of this area, right? They speak the same amount of Polish on the edges as they do in the middle, right? They grow the same amount of corn in the far western part of the Corn Belt as they do in the far eastern part, as they do in the north, as they do right in the middle of Iowa. All right, you see formal regions in politics, right? These folks, right? And the states are formal regions. You can find them on the map. They're uniform throughout. You are no less Minnesotan if you live right up here on Lake of the Woods than you are if you live right a block from the state capital. Okay, you'll see this in elections, you'll see this in politics as well. Our second type is functional or nodal regions, right? And these are something where the center is very strong, the node, right? And there's distance decay or weakness the further out you get. You are less likely to see Vikings fans the further you get away from the US Bank Stadium, right? You are less likely to meet a Bronco fan the further away you get from Denver, and so on and so forth. So we can talk about it in terms of fandom, Twins territory or whatnot. You can also talk about it in terms of market areas. Think of it as a radio signal, right? And I know a lot of you do satellite radio and you don't necessarily listen to a radio anymore, but a radio signal is strongest when it's closest to the radio tower, and it gets weaker the further out you go, right? Market area, you're more likely to eat pizza from this pizza place, right? If you are closer to that than if you are further away. So you'll see distance decay happening, right? You'll see this in terms of fandom here, Twins and Brewers as well. There is definitely a divide as you go. All right, our third one is the term vernacular or perceptual. And again, we get into sense of place here, right? And we get into mental mapping and this idea of what the Twin Cities is, right? Does the Twin Cities, does it start at and stop at Minneapolis and St. Paul? Is everything else not part of the Twin Cities? I would argue that it's not, that it isn't. It's more of it's a bigger region than that. Some people use the 11 county metro region. Some people will say the 14 county metro region. Some people will say, some people think of it as just Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's a matter of perception, right? And your perception might change depending on who you're talking to. So if you're driving and you're in Texas, right? And you stop at a diner with your family and they ask you where y'all from, and you might say Minnesota, right? And they might ask you a little bit more. Right, and you say, "Oh, I'm from the Twin Cities." Do they, and they might say, "Oh, I have relatives there," and then you might have to be a little bit more specific, right? So you think in terms of perception, right? There's a vernacular region. We talk about the South, right? The Midwest. Where does the Midwest start? Where does the South start? Right? These big regions of the United States are great examples of vernacular regions, right? And so we look at different ways to define the South. Was it a Confederate state during the Civil War, right? We're starting to get into some stereotypes here. Does it have below average high school and college graduation rates, right? Is it right to work or anti-union states? Is it a climactic thing, right? Where winter precipitation exceeds 21 inches, right? And that's your definition. Below that would be the South, right? Is it more than 50% Baptist, right? Because we have this area called the Bible Belt in here, or is it just warmer, right? So what is the South? Where does it fall, right? Does Florida belong in the South, right? When you think of the South, do you think of Florida or do you think of Georgia or Mississippi, right? Where does Texas fit into that? Where does West Virginia fit into that? Right? Is that part of the South? All right? Where does Indiana fit into that? Because Indiana is an interesting place, right? So there you go. There's a vernacular region. Spatial associations, right? So we look at patterns, right? In terms of where we can look at it in terms of median income. We can look at it in terms of population, right? Again, we look at patterns and we look at density. We look at population. Where is population? We can look at this in terms of the opioid crisis, right? And go from there. Your book gets into that a little bit. All right. We got to define culture as we move on here. Culture is customs and traditions that make a group unique. It's what we care about and what we care for, right? So we talk about cultural ecology as well. And cultural ecology has two different theories. One of them is outdated, right? Environmental determinism. And then the other one is possibilism, right? So environmental determinism says that the environment determines how your culture is going to go, right? How are we impacted by our environment, right? Whereas possibilism says, no, it is possible for human beings to overcome these environmental barriers and make things happen, right? So we look at the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome here. Rest in peace. Oh, the Metrodome. Actually, I'm kidding. It's a terrible place. But the Metrodome, right, made it possible for people to play football year-round in Minnesota, right? We look at a cultural trait. Again, this is a green slide. It's a single attribute. So an example would be wearing a turban in Muslim societies. Right? A cultural complex is a set of cultural traits. So dress codes, not just the turban, but the entire how it's worn, why it's worn, when it's worn, what it's worn with, right? Eating utensils are a cultural trait, right? So the cultural trait would be the chopsticks or the fork and knife, right? But how you eat the ritualistic ideas of going through that becomes a cultural complex, right? Raising cattle is a good example of that. All right. So how you feed animals, how you slaughter animals, the use of the hides, what the cattle means. In some societies, the cattle is a price for a bride, right? It's not necessarily a price for the bride in the United States. The use of milk, is it used to feed um, the animal? Again, is it used to fed to humans? All of these things, right? All of these traits add up and become a cultural complex. That is it for now. Continue plugging away at 1.3 and 1.4. Have a good day.